March 2019. A cold rain hammered the streets of Philadelphia's Kensington neighborhood as dawn broke over the city. 3 unmarked police vehicles pulled up to a modest row house on East Allegheny Avenue at exactly 6:47 a.m. Detective Margaret Sullivan was reviewing case files in her office at the homicide unit when her phone rang with news that would crack open a case that had haunted the city for 53 years. What began as a routine DNA database hit transformed into the arrest that would shatter the reputation of one of Philadelphia's most respected retired educators and send shockwaves through the entire Catholic school system. If you're interested in true crime cases with details that mainstream media overlooks, hit that like button and subscribe, because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about this case. Sister Catherine Ann Brennan was born on March 15, 1940, in the Fishtown neighborhood of Philadelphia to Irish immigrant parents Thomas Brennan, a longshoreman at Penn's Landing, and Mary Margaret O'Malley Brennan, a seamstress who worked from their home on East York Street. Catherine was the eldest of 4 children, followed by brothers Michael and Patrick, and sister Eileen. Standing at 5 feet 4 inches tall, Catherine had distinctive auburn hair that she would later conceal beneath her religious habit, striking brown eyes that former students remembered as incredibly kind, and a small birthmark on her left cheek that she was self-conscious about as a teenager. Catherine always wanted to help people, her mother Mary would later recall in a 1967 Philadelphia Inquirer interview. Even as a little girl, she would bring home stray cats and injured birds. She had the biggest heart of anyone I've ever known. Her younger brother Michael remembered, "Kathy used to read to me every night before bed, even when she was tired from her own schoolwork. She made every story come alive." Catherine graduated from Little Flower Catholic High School for Girls in 1958 with honors and immediately entered the Sisters of Mercy novitiate, driven by what her spiritual director, Father James Morrison, described as an unshakable calling to serve God through education. By 1964, she had taken her final vows and begun teaching 2nd grade at St. Bartholomew Elementary School in the Frankford section of Philadelphia. Her dream was to eventually earn a master's degree in education and help develop curriculum for underprivileged children across the archdiocese. In the spring of 1966, Catherine maintained a rigorous routine, waking at 5 a.m. for morning prayers, teaching her class of 32 children from 8:30 a.m. to 3 p.m., leading after-school tutoring sessions 3 days a week, and spending her evenings preparing lessons and grading papers in the convent she shared with 5 other sisters on Kinsey Street, Philadelphia, in 1966, was a city of contradictions and transformation. The Frankford neighborhood, where St. Bartholomew School stood at 4949 Frankford Avenue, was a working-class community of approximately 45,000 residents, predominantly Irish and Italian Catholic families who had lived in the area for generations. The streets were lined with corner stores, family-owned delis and churches that served as the social anchors of the community. The Vietnam War dominated national headlines, and Philadelphia saw frequent protests and rallies, both supporting and opposing American involvement. Locally, Mayor James Tate's administration was dealing with rising concerns about urban crime, though Frankford was still considered one of the safer neighborhoods in the city. The Frankford L, the elevated train line that ran along Frankford Avenue, provided the rhythmic soundtrack of daily life, its metal wheels screeching around curves every few minutes. St. Bartholomew Church, built in 1932, stood as a neo-Gothic monument at the corner of Frankford and Buckier Street, its twin spires visible for blocks. The parish served over 2,000 families and ran one of the most respected elementary schools in the archdiocese, with enrollment exceeding 600 students. Children walked to school in uniform groups. Parents knew all their neighbors and doors were rarely locked. It was the kind of place where everyone looked out for each other, former parishioner Dorothy Walsh recalled in a 2019 interview. "We never imagined something like this could happen here." April 26, 1966, started as an ordinary Tuesday for Sister Catherine Brennan. 8 a.m. Catherine rose for morning prayers in the convent chapel with Sisters Margaret, Rose, Teresa, Judith, and Elizabeth. 6:15 a.m. She helped prepare breakfast in the convent kitchen, her assigned duty that week. 7:30 a.m. Catherine walked the 4 blocks from the convent to St. Bartholomew School, carrying her worn leather satchel filled with spelling tests to grade. 8:15 a.m. She greeted students arriving for school at the main entrance, as was her custom every morning. "Good morning, Bobby. Did you finish your homework?" she asked Robert Chen, age 7, who would remember those words for the rest of his life. 8:30 a.m. Morning bell rang, and Catherine led her second-grade class in the Pledge of Allegiance and morning prayers. 10:45 a.m. During recess, Catherine supervised students on the playground while discussing the upcoming May crowning ceremony with Sister Margaret. 12:00 p.m. Lunch in the convent with the other sisters, where she mentioned feeling excited about a new reading program she wanted to implement. 3:00 p.m. School dismissed, and Catherine stayed to help student Maria Gonzalez with her reading comprehension. 4:15 p.m. Catherine told Sister Rose she was walking to the parish library in the church basement to return some books and pick up materials for Thursday's lesson. "I'll be back before dinner," she said, her last recorded words. 4:35 p.m. Mr. Anthony DeMarco, the church custodian, saw Catherine entering the side door of the church that led to the basement stairs. 6:30 p.m. When Catherine failed to appear for dinner, the sisters initially assumed she had been delayed in conversation with Father Morrison or another parish member. The discovery came at 7:45 p.m. when Sister Margaret and Sister Teresa went to look for Catherine, worried because missing dinner without notice was completely unlike her. They entered the church through the main doors, calling her name in the darkening sanctuary. Finding the church empty, Sister Margaret descended the wooden stairs to the basement library while Sister Teresa checked the sacristy. The basement of St. Bartholomew Church was a labyrinth of storage rooms, the boiler room and the parish library, a converted storage space lined with donated books and old desks. Sister Margaret found Catherine's body in the far corner of the library, behind a row of tall bookshelves that blocked the view from the stairs. Catherine lay on her back, her religious habit disheveled, her white coif torn and lying beside her. Her face bore evidence of trauma, with bruising around her neck and what would later be identified as petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes. The medical examiner would determine she had been manually strangled. Her leather satchel was found nearby, its contents scattered, including the spelling tests she had been grading and her personal rosary, a gift from her mother. Physical evidence collected at the scene included a partial shoe print in dust near the body, measuring men's size 10, fiber evidence from what appeared to be a dark wool sweater caught on a splinter of the bookshelf, a small amount of blood under Catherine's fingernails, indicating she had fought her attacker, a single brown button found 3 feet from the body, cigarette ash near the entrance to the library, though none of the sisters smoked, scuff marks on the floor suggesting a struggle, and, most significantly, biological evidence that would remain unidentified for 53 years. Father Morrison, who arrived within minutes of being called, would later say, "I kept thinking this must be a mistake, that she would wake up. Catherine was pure goodness. Who could do such a thing?" By 8:30 p.m., police had cordoned off the entire church basement, and news was spreading through the neighborhood like wildfire. Mrs. Helen Kowalski, who lived across the street from the church, remembered, "I saw all the police cars and ambulance, and I just knew something terrible had happened. Then I saw them bringing out a stretcher with a body bag, and I started praying it wasn't one of the sisters. We want to hear from you. Where are you watching this from? This crime could have happened in any community. Leave a comment below about how this case affects you." The investigation fell to the Philadelphia Police Department's Homicide Division, then led by Captain William Bill Donnelly, a 22-year veteran who had never worked a case involving the murder of a nun. In 1966, the Detective Bureau had limited resources compared to modern standards. There was no computerized database, no DNA analysis, no security cameras, and fingerprint analysis was done manually using ink cards and magnifying glasses. The investigation team consisted of detectives Frank Rizzo Jr., not related to the future mayor, and Thomas O'Brien, both experienced homicide investigators who had worked dozens of cases in the city. From the beginning, investigators identified several individuals who required close scrutiny. The first suspect was Anthony Michael DeMarco, age 43, the church custodian who had been the last known person to see Sister Catherine alive. DeMarco had worked at St. Bartholomew for 7 years and was responsible for maintaining the church building, including the basement areas. He lived alone in a small apartment on Frankfurt Avenue and had a reputation as a quiet, solitary man who kept to himself. Investigators discovered that DeMarco had been dishonorably discharged from the army in 1945 for insubordination and had served 90 days in county jail in 1952 for assault during a bar fight. His connection to the victim was professional but frequent, as Catherine often stayed late at the school and would see him during his evening rounds. The apparent motive centered on opportunity and access, as DeMarco had keys to every room in the church complex and knew Catherine's routines. When questioned on April 27, 1966, DeMarco stated his alibi. He claimed he had finished his work at 5 p.m. and went directly to McGlinchey's Tavern on Frankfurt Avenue, where he remained until 7:30 p.m. The bartender, Patrick Sullivan, confirmed seeing DeMarco there but could not account for every minute. Investigators searched DeMarco's apartment and found nothing connecting him to the crime. The button found at the scene did not match any of his clothing, and his shoe size was 9, not 10. After 3 weeks of intensive investigation, including multiple polygraph examinations which he passed, DeMarco was excluded as a suspect, though the experience destroyed his reputation and he left Philadelphia within 6 months. The second person of interest was Father Kevin Michael Bradley, age 35, an associate pastor at St. Bartholomew who had arrived at the parish in September 1965. Father Bradley was known for his charismatic preaching and his dedication to youth ministry, coaching the parish basketball team and organizing social events for teenagers. Born in South Philadelphia to a working-class family, Bradley had attended St. Charles Borromeo Seminary and been ordained in 1960. Investigators learned that Father Bradley had developed what some described as an unusually close interest in Sister Catherine's work, often visiting her classroom and offering to help her with various projects. 2 other sisters in the convent, speaking confidentially to detectives, mentioned that Catherine had seemed uncomfortable with Father Bradley's attention in recent weeks, though she had never made a formal complaint. On April 26, Father Bradley claimed he had been at a clergy meeting at the cathedral downtown from 3 p.m. until 6:15 p.m., then stopped for dinner at a diner on Broad Street before returning to the rectory around 7:30 p.m. His alibi was partially verified by 2 other priests who attended the meeting, but there was a gap between 6:15 p.m. and his appearance at the diner at 6:45 p.m., approximately 30 minutes unaccounted for. However, the cathedral was 7 miles from St. Bartholomew, making the timeline extremely tight. Detectives found Father Bradley's demeanor during questioning evasive and defensive, but they had no physical evidence linking him to the crime. The Archdiocese refused to allow investigators to search his private quarters in the rectory without a warrant, and judges in 1966 were extremely reluctant to issue warrants involving Catholic clergy. Father Bradley remained at St. Bartholomew until 1968, when he was transferred to a parish in Reading, Pennsylvania. The investigation into him officially concluded with no charges, though detectives never fully eliminated him from their list of persons of interest. A third suspect emerged when investigators learned about James Patrick Callahan, age 28, a former maintenance worker who had been fired from St. Bartholomew School in March 1966, just 6 weeks before the murder. Callahan had worked at the school for only 4 months before being terminated for what school records described as inappropriate behavior and unreliability, including showing up to work intoxicated on at least 2 occasions. Several teachers, including Sister Catherine, had complained that Callahan made them uncomfortable with his staring and his habit of appearing unexpectedly in classrooms and hallways. Callahan lived with his elderly mother on Pratt Street, just 8 blocks from the church, and had a criminal record including arrests for public intoxication and disturbing the peace. Detectives investigating Callahan discovered he harbored significant resentment about his firing, which he blamed primarily on Sister Catherine, telling neighbors she had gotten him fired and ruined his life. On April 26, 1966, Callahan claimed he had been home with his mother all afternoon and evening. His mother, 71-year-old Margaret Callahan, supported this alibi, stating that James had been home since noon and never left the house. However, neighbors reported seeing Callahan leaving his house around 4 p.m. and returning after dark. When confronted with this discrepancy, Callahan changed his story, admitting he had walked to a corner store for cigarettes, but insisting he went nowhere near the church. Investigators found Callahan's behavior during interrogations suspicious and aggressive, and his obvious anger toward Sister Catherine provided a clear motive. However, despite multiple searches of his home and questioning of his associates, police found no physical evidence connecting him to the crime scene. The shoe print did not match his shoes, and he did not own any dark wool sweaters matching the fibers found at the scene. By June 1966, without sufficient evidence to charge him, Callahan was released from scrutiny, though he remained on the informal suspect list for years. Additional persons of interest included Mr. Robert Eugene Walsh, age 52, a married father of 3 who worked as a delivery driver and made regular deliveries to the church and school. Walsh had been seen in the area on April 26th, but had a solid alibi confirmed by multiple delivery receipts and witnesses. There was also brief investigation into a drifter who had been seen in the neighborhood, described by witnesses as a white male in his 30s with long hair and shabby clothing, but this individual was never identified or located. The physical evidence collected proved frustrating in the pre-DNA era. The biological evidence found on Sister Catherine's habit could not be definitively analyzed with 1966 technology. Blood typing was performed, indicating the sample came from someone with type A blood, which eliminated some suspects but still encompassed roughly 40% of the population. The fiber evidence suggested the attacker wore a dark wool sweater, possibly navy or black, but this was common clothing in 1966 Philadelphia. The partial shoe print was photographed and measured, but could not be matched to any specific brand or model. The button appeared to be from a men's cardigan sweater, possibly hand-knit, but searches of suspects' clothing revealed no matching garments with missing buttons. The cigarette ash was collected, but offered little investigative value in an era when the majority of adult men smoked. Fingerprint analysis of the library and surrounding areas yielded dozens of prints, but in 1966 fingerprint databases were limited and manual comparison was time-consuming and often inconclusive. By August 1966, the investigation had essentially stalled. The initial surge of tips and leads had dried up, and detectives had exhausted their immediate avenues of inquiry. Captain Donnelly assigned 2 detectives to continue working the case part-time, but with no new evidence and no viable suspects, progress became impossible. In September 1966, Philadelphia experienced a series of armed robberies that diverted significant manpower from the homicide division. The death of Sister Catherine Brennan received extensive coverage in local media for the first 6 weeks, but by fall, public attention had moved on to other tragedies and concerns. The last significant investigative activity occurred in November 1966, when Detective O'Brien conducted final interviews with several witnesses, hoping fresh perspectives might reveal new information, but nothing materialized. In March 1967, exactly 1 year after Catherine's death, the case was officially moved to the cold case files, designated as unsolved. The evidence was carefully preserved and stored in the police department's evidence warehouse, where it would remain untouched for decades. Captain Donnelly, who retired in 1972, would later tell reporters that the Brennan case was one of only 3 murders in his career that he had been unable to solve, and it haunted him until his death in 1998. What time is it where you're watching this? Think about how much time has passed in this case while families waited for answers that seemed like they would never come. Thomas and Mary Brennan never recovered from the loss of their eldest daughter. Thomas Patrick Brennan, age 52 at the time of Catherine's death, had worked as a longshoreman for 28 years, a physically demanding job that required him to load and unload ships at Philadelphia's busy port. After Catherine's murder, Thomas became consumed with finding her killer, spending his evenings and weekends visiting the police station, pressuring detectives for updates, and conducting his own amateur investigation in the neighborhood. "My father became a different person," Catherine's brother Michael recalled in a 2019 interview. "He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. He was obsessed with getting justice for Kathy. It destroyed his health. Thomas developed heart problems in 1970, which his doctors attributed partly to stress and grief. He suffered his first heart attack in 1973 and was forced to retire from the docks on disability. He spent his remaining years writing letters to police commissioners, mayors, and even governors, begging them not to forget Catherine's case. Thomas died of a massive heart attack on April 26, 1984, exactly 18 years to the day after his daughter's murder, never knowing who had killed her. Mary Margaret Brennan transformed her grief into a different kind of action. She became deeply involved in victim advocacy work, helping to establish one of Philadelphia's first support groups for families of murder victims in 1968. Mom said if she couldn't get justice for Kathy, at least she could help other families navigate the nightmare we were living, daughter Eileen Brennan Calloway explained. Mary attended every victims' rights hearing and legislative session related to crime victims in Pennsylvania throughout the 1970s and 1980s. She kept Catherine's bedroom exactly as it had been the day she entered the convent, preserving her daughter's books, photographs, and personal items as a shrine. Every year on the anniversary of Catherine's death, Mary organized a memorial mass at St. Bartholomew Church, which continued even as attendance dwindled over the decades. Mary developed dementia in 1995 and spent her final years in a nursing home, often asking visitors when Catherine would be coming to visit her. She died in 2001 at age 88, having spent 35 years seeking answers that never came during her lifetime. Michael Thomas Brennan, Catherine's younger brother who was 22 years old when she was murdered, channeled his rage and grief into becoming a police officer himself. Michael joined the Philadelphia Police Department in 1968, driven by what he openly acknowledged was a desire to find his sister's killer. "I thought if I was on the inside I could keep the case alive, make sure it didn't get forgotten," Michael said in a deposition given in 2019. He spent 30 years with the department, eventually rising to the rank of sergeant in the Northeast Division, but he never worked in homicide and was never allowed to officially investigate his sister's case due to conflict of interest. Still, Michael made it his personal mission to review the case file every year on the anniversary of Catherine's death, checking for any new developments or investigative techniques that might be applied. He maintained relationships with detectives in the homicide unit throughout his career, gently but persistently reminding them that Catherine's case remained unsolved. Michael retired from the force in 1998, disappointed that he had been unable to fulfill his primary motivation for joining. He married late in life at age 42 to a fellow police officer named Patricia, and they had one daughter whom they named Catherine in honor of his murdered sister. Michael lived to see his sister's case solved, though the revelation of who killed her would prove almost as devastating as her death had been. Patrick James Brennan, the middle brother who was 19 when Catherine died, dealt with the trauma by leaving Philadelphia entirely. Patrick had been extremely close to Catherine growing up, and her death sent him into a spiral of depression and anger. He dropped out of Temple University, where he had been studying engineering, and in 1967 enlisted in the Marine Corps, seeking an escape from the pain and unanswered questions. Patrick served 2 tours in Vietnam, and when he returned in 1971, he moved to California, rarely communicating with his family. Patrick just couldn't bear to be in Philadelphia anymore, Eileen explained. Every street corner reminded him of Kathy. He felt guilty for being alive when she was dead. Patrick struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder from his military service and with unresolved grief over his sister's murder. He worked various jobs in Los Angeles, including as a security guard and warehouse supervisor, never marrying or having children. He maintained minimal contact with his family, sending Christmas cards but rarely calling or visiting. When his mother died in 2001, Patrick returned to Philadelphia for the funeral, the first time he had been back in nearly 30 years. He broke down at his mother's graveside, telling his siblings, "I failed her, I failed Kathy, and I failed Mom. I should have been there to protect them." Patrick died of liver disease in 2012 at age 65, having never learned who killed his sister, Eileen Margaret Brennan Calloway, the youngest sibling who was only 16 when Catherine was murdered, carried the weight of being the surviving daughter. Eileen had idolized her older sister, and had been considering following Catherine into religious life herself. After the murder, Eileen abandoned any thoughts of becoming a nun, later saying, "How could I believe in a God who would let that happen to someone as good as Kathy?" She graduated from high school in 1968 and attended community college, eventually becoming a nurse. Eileen married her high school sweetheart, Dennis Calloway, in 1971, and they had 4 children together. She named her first daughter Catherine Rose, ensuring her sister's name would live on in the next generation. Throughout her life, Eileen served as the family's memory keeper, maintaining photo albums, preserving Catherine's letters and personal effects, and ensuring that her nieces and nephews knew about the aunt they never met. "My kids grew up knowing Aunt Kathy's story," Eileen said in 2019. "I made sure they understood that she wasn't just a victim, she was a real person who loved life and wanted to make the world better." Eileen attended every memorial mass her mother organized, and after Mary's death, continued the tradition herself, even when only a handful of people showed up. She cooperated with every cold case review, providing investigators with family photographs, letters, and any information they requested. At age 69, Eileen would finally witness the arrest of her sister's killer, an event that brought closure but also opened old wounds she thought had scarred over decades ago. The case underwent its first significant review in 1985, when the Philadelphia Police Department created a dedicated cold case unit as part of a broader modernization effort under Police Commissioner Kevin Tucker. Detective Lieutenant James Morrison, no relation to the Father Morrison from the original case, was assigned to review dozens of unsolved homicides from the 1960s and 1970s. In July 1985, Morrison pulled the Brennan file and spent 3 months re-interviewing witnesses who were still alive and re-examining the physical evidence with fresh eyes. He arranged for the biological evidence to be retested using newer serological techniques that had become available since 1966, but the results added little new information beyond confirming the original blood type analysis. Morrison's review concluded that without a confession or new witness testimony, the case remained unsolvable with existing technology. His final report, dated October 15, 1985, recommended keeping the evidence preserved in case future scientific advances might allow for better analysis, a prescient suggestion that would prove crucial decades later. The second major review occurred in 1998, prompted by advances in DNA analysis technology that were revolutionizing cold case investigations across the country. Detective Sarah Chen of the Cold Case Unit submitted the biological evidence from the Brennan case for DNA testing at the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab. The testing, conducted between March and August 1998, successfully extracted a partial DNA profile from the evidence, a significant breakthrough. However, the sample was degraded due to age and storage conditions, resulting in an incomplete profile that could not be used for definitive identification. More critically, when the partial profile was run through CODIS, the combined DNA index system database that had been established in 1998, there were no matches. This meant that whoever had left the biological evidence at the crime scene in 1966 either had never been arrested for a crime requiring DNA submission or had died before DNA collection became standard practice. Detective Chen's report, dated September 22, 1998, noted the frustrating paradox. They now had DNA evidence that could potentially identify the killer, but without a suspect to compare it to, the evidence remained scientifically interesting but investigatively useless. The case was returned to the cold case files with a notation that it should be reviewed again as DNA technology continued to improve. A third review in 2006 yielded similar disappointing results. Detective Marcus Williams attempted to use newer DNA amplification techniques that had become available, hoping to generate a more complete profile from the degraded sample. The testing, performed at a private forensics laboratory in Virginia, did produce a slightly more complete profile with additional genetic markers, but it still fell short of the quality needed for a definitive match. Running the improved profile through CODIS again in December 2006 produced no hits. Williams also attempted to trace the genealogy of the suspects from the original investigation, checking whether any of them had died and might be eliminated through DNA comparison with relatives, But this avenue proved legally and practically complicated. Anthony DeMarco had died in 1989 in Florida, leaving no known relatives. Father Bradley had died in 2001, and the Archdiocese refused to provide any biological samples from his personal effects without a court order. James Callahan was still alive but living in a nursing home with advanced Alzheimer's disease, and his appointed legal guardian refused to allow DNA collection without a warrant, which judges were reluctant to issue based on 40-year-old suspicions without new evidence. Over the decades, the physical landscape of Frankfurt changed dramatically, while the memory of Sister Catherine's murder gradually faded from community consciousness. St. Bartholomew School, which had enrollment of over 600 students in 1966, saw its numbers decline through the 1970s and 1980s as Catholic school enrollment dropped nationwide and the neighborhood's demographics shifted. The school closed permanently in 2010, and the building was converted into apartments. The church itself, after struggling with declining attendance and financial problems, merged with 2 other parishes in 2015 and was eventually deconsecrated. The building now houses a community center. The convent where Catherine lived was demolished in 1992 to make way for a parking lot. Many of the row houses on the streets where witnesses had lived have been renovated or replaced. The Frankfurt L still runs along Frankfurt Avenue, but many of the small businesses that defined the neighborhood in 1966 are long gone. The case influenced local policy in some small ways. The Archdiocese of Philadelphia implemented new security measures at schools and churches, including better lighting in isolated areas and requirements that religious sisters and lay teachers not work alone in buildings after hours. These policies, while not explicitly attributed to Catherine's murder, were clearly influenced by the tragedy. Among longtime residents and former parishioners, the case remained a topic of occasional conversation at reunions and gatherings, but for newer residents of the neighborhood, Sister Catherine Brennan was an unknown name, her story lost to time. What's the weather like where you are? Just as seasons change, so do the stages of grief for families like the Brennans, cycling through anger, hope, and despair year after year. The breakthrough that would finally solve the case came on February 14th, 2019, Valentine's Day, when Detective Margaret Sullivan of the Philadelphia Police Cold Case Unit received an email notification from a genetic genealogy consultant the department had hired. The consultant, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, had been working with investigative genetic genealogy, a revolutionary technique that had gained national attention in 2018 when it was used to identify the Golden State Killer. Dr. Martinez had uploaded the DNA profile from the Brennan case evidence to GEDmatch, a public genetic genealogy database where people who had taken consumer DNA tests could upload their results to find relatives. Unlike law enforcement DNA databases like CODIS, which only contained profiles of convicted criminals, GEDmatch contained DNA from ordinary citizens interested in genealogy, and it was much larger. On February 12, 2019, the Brennan case DNA profile generated a match indicating a third-cousin relationship with someone in the database. Using traditional genealogical research methods, Dr. Martinez had spent 2 days building family trees and working backwards from the third cousin to identify possible suspects. Her email to Detective Sullivan contained a name: Joseph William Gallagher. The technique that cracked the case was investigative genetic genealogy, a method that combines DNA analysis with traditional genealogical research. Dr. Martinez explained the process in her testimony. When someone takes a consumer DNA test from companies like 23andMe or Ancestry, they receive information about their ethnicity and potential relatives who share segments of DNA with them. The amount of shared DNA indicates how closely related two people are. A parent and child share about 50% of their DNA, siblings share about 50%, first cousins share about 12.5%, and third cousins share about 0.78%. Even distant relatives share small segments of DNA that can be detected and measured. The process begins with uploading the crime scene DNA profile to genealogy databases, then identifying the closest matches. In this case, we found a third cousin match, Dr. Martinez continued. From there, I used genealogical records, birth certificates, marriage records, census data, obituaries, everything available, to build out the family trees of all the third cousin's ancestors, going back to the common great-great-great-grandparents they would share with our unknown suspect. Then I worked forward, identifying all the descendants of those common ancestors, creating essentially a list of everyone who could possibly be the source of that DNA based on the genetic relationship. Dr. Brian Hutchison, a forensic genetics expert who reviewed the work, noted, "This method has a very high success rate when sufficient DNA quality exists and when there are enough relatives in the databases. The chance of error is extremely low, typically less than 1 in a trillion when you have a good quality DNA sample and strong genealogical evidence." The technique differed dramatically from traditional methods because it did not require the actual perpetrator to be in any database. It only required that distant relatives had submitted their DNA for genealogy purposes. This has revolutionized cold case investigation, Dr. Martinez explained. Cases that were completely unsolvable 5 years ago can now be resolved. The name Joseph William Gallagher sent shockwaves through the cold case unit because Gallagher was not an unknown figure in Philadelphia. Joseph William Gallagher was 82 years old in February 2019, living in a modest home in the Port Richmond neighborhood of Philadelphia, just 3 miles from where Sister Catherine had been murdered. In April 1966, when Catherine was killed, Joseph Gallagher had been 29 years old, a recent college graduate working his first teaching job. He was employed as a 6th-grade teacher at St. Bartholomew Elementary School, the same school where Sister Catherine taught 2nd grade. Gallagher had started at the school in September 1965, making him a relatively new faculty member. He graduated from LaSalle University in 1964 with a degree in education and had spent 1 year teaching at a public school before accepting the position at St. Bartholomew. In the original 1966 investigation, Gallagher had been briefly interviewed as a colleague of the victim, but he was never considered a serious suspect. His name appeared in the case file exactly 3 times, once in a list of all faculty members who were interviewed, once in notes indicating he had attended Catherine's funeral, and once in a brief notation that he had provided a statement saying he had left the school at 3:30 p.m. on April 26th and gone directly home, seeing nothing unusual. Detectives in 1966 had no reason to doubt his account, and he was never questioned again. For 53 years after Catherine's murder, Joseph Gallagher had lived what appeared to be an exemplary and honorable life, a fact that would make the revelation of his guilt particularly disturbing.